Hello, this is Tom that just jumped on. I'm also here. Alan, are you on the line?
I am.
And any other counsel on the line?
Victoria here.
And who we're missing? John? No.
Yeah, it'd be. This is Sean McGlenn. It would be Mr. Sawyer.
Okay, let's wait a couple. Oh, John, are you there? Did anyone copy that?
Let me text him.
And Alan, are all your staff that needs to be present?
I believe so. The consultants are here, and I'm here. So, and we may have other staff on the line as well. So, I think we're good.
Okay, so let's just see if Mr. Sawyer can join us, and then we'll go ahead and start.
And this is Elisa. I'm the recording secretary, and I am here.
Okay.
This is Shelley. I am here.
And Tom, this is Stephanie. I'm helping Elisa facilitate the presentation.
Okay. And Stephanie, would you or Elisa do the roll call?
Yes, when you're ready, just let us know, and Elisa will do the roll call.
Yeah. Why don't we? I've got it as a couple minutes after 2:30, so why don't we go ahead and start? Let's do the roll call.
Roll call, please. Chair Schwetholm.
I'm here.
Member Fleming.
Here.
Member Sawyer.
Councilmember Sawyer will be joining momentarily.
Thank you.
So why don't we wait a moment to see if John can join us.
And just for the record, I do need to adjourn for a meeting with the county at 3:30. So if the presentation continues, Alan will be able to take any notes that you need to give to the city manager and pass along.
Okay, great. Why don't we go ahead and just roll into then? We've called the meeting to order. We got the roll call. Do we have any public comments?
John is here.
Great. Good to hear your voice, John.
Thank you, Mayor.
And Chair Schwetholm, to answer a question, there is no public comment received.
Okay. Approval of minutes. John and Victoria, did you get a chance to review the meeting minutes from the special meeting from January 16th? And if so, do you have any?
Okay. Yeah, I was unable to download them, so for some weird reason, which doesn't surprise me. So I'll just abstain.
Okay, Victoria, did you have any changes or adjustments?
No, thank you.
And nor did I, so we will accept those minutes. On to item 4, item 4.1, who will be presenting that?
I will. This is Alan Alton. So, Chairman Schwetholm and members of the subcommittee, the purpose of this item is to review an update of our general fund long-range financial forecast. So, as the shelter-in-place was instituted, and we started realizing that there would be some significant impacts on revenue, we reached out to Management Partners, who is the consultant that created our existing version of the long-range financial forecast. And we requested that they would do an update that would take into account revenue impacts relative to the shelter in place and any potential recessionary situations that would come up after that. So we have Bob Leland and Andy Belknap who worked with us through creating the assumptions and coming up with the new forecast. And Bob Leland is here to walk you through the presentation. So, Bob, you can take it away.
Alan, before you move on, just out of curiosity, how can I access the presentation, or is there one that I can follow along with?
There is a presentation. This is Stephanie. There is a presentation, John. You should have received it in an email, and this is being live streamed, but I don't know if you'll be able to see it through your iPad, but you should be able to open it with an iPad so you can follow along.
And I do have my iPad in front of me. What I received from Alyssa has the, let me check, hold on a second. Actually, yeah, I think it's coming up now. I was not able to get it through my desktop. I think that was my confusion. So yes, I have it in front of me.
Okay.
Sorry for the interruption. Thank you.
No problem. The first slide is up, Bob. Just let me know when you want me to advance the slides.
Okay. This is Bob Leland, Special Advisor for Management Partners. We're going to have some interesting logistics here. I'm going to tell Elisa to advance the slides, and as she does that, I will walk through those. So go ahead and go to slide 2. All right, so Management Partners specializes in working with local government clients nationwide. Most of California's largest cities are our clients. We perform a range of services, but the one that I'm involved with is financial planning and budgeting. And so that, let's go to slide 3. So our project here was to prepare a long-range fiscal model, and we started that on the fall of last year before all of this uproar occurred, and we had what looked like a pretty plain vanilla model of the future. And things suddenly went sideways in the last month or so. And so we have been busy working with clients all over the state, updating their models to build in our latest thinking in terms of the impact of the COVID-19. Now, with any fiscal model, there's a real advantage to bringing in an outside perspective, getting a second opinion. Personally, I've been doing long-range forecasting for 38 years. I was the director of finance for the city of Fairfield for 26 years. And before that was with Sacramento and the state legislative committee on revenue and taxation back during the days of Prop 13. Since I retired and started up with Management Partners, we've handled a couple of bankruptcies. I did the long-range plan for Stockton and defended that in bankruptcy court. And we've done about 30 fiscal models since then. The key to any model is identifying the major factors involved, spending levels that are largely controlled by the city and all those economic factors beyond the city's control. The model itself is 20-year forecast. We use that many years so that we can see the long-term implications of CalPERS. And the model is very robust. It's flexible, transparent. It sets up a set of baseline projections, allows you to make a number of alternate scenarios. And in particular, we have upgraded it to go into this issue of COVID-19. Slide 4. So before we get into that, just a quick overview of the fiscal environment. It's challenging for agencies throughout the state, and then there's some unique issues as they relate to Santa Rosa. Front and center is the issue of dealing with COVID-19 recession. We're going to spend most of our time today talking about that. But beyond that, there was a continuing revenue gap in terms of the per capita revenues that the city's capable of generating. That's something in common with other agencies throughout the state. Wage pressures, demands for new housing, pension cost increases, and the deferred maintenance are all needs that are common to everybody. Special issues for Santa Rosa, the fire recovery impact on local revenues. There's the issue of the units burned in the Tubbs fire and them getting rebuilt, as well as consideration of new housing in addition to that. The general fund carries a large carryover appropriation, which we've excluded from the unassigned balance because it is earmarked largely for capital projects and other operations. That's about $39 million. And that is available to the City Council if it decides to defund any of those projects and move appropriations to undesignated balance. There's also the issue of the 3 local quarter-cent sales taxes that expire in 2025 and 2027. 2 of those are general taxes and are in the general fund, and the third is a special tax for police and fire. But the assumption is that if the taxes go away, the services are still there and would have to be borne by the general fund, absent either cutting the services or finding replacement revenue or extending the term of those sales taxes. The city also has had a policy of transferring its real property transfer tax revenue to the Housing Authority and homeless shelter. And the real property transfer tax will be affected by this recession. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's just the volatility in recent years of interdepartmental personnel cost charges and reimbursements. So let's go to slide 5. So what we're going to do today is take a look at the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, and we're going to walk you through our model and its assumed impact on your revenue sources. As we go through there, there's a real distinction between fiscal year 20, the year we're in right now, and fiscal year 21, next year. As bad as things are right now, it's actually easier to estimate what's going to happen because of the economic shutdown for this last 3.5 months of the fiscal year. Up until then, things have been sailing along pretty well. So it's the last few months that of this current year that are going to cause a downturn. But the question is for fiscal 21, will we be at the point of a beginning recovery in June or July? That's the optimistic view. A more pessimistic view, or maybe just realistic, is that there's a whole lot we don't know. The economy has suffered just an amazing setback in a very short period of time. It's going to take time for people to get back to work, to feel safe interacting in the kinds of ways that generate revenue for local government. And while this year had 3.5 months to go wrong, next year there's all 12 months that could go wrong. So next year is the big question. And then there are other issues: pensions, fire rebuild, reserve levels. We'll take a quick look at those. And then finally summarize the baseline forecast, showing you our projected revenue loss. And then we'll take a look at some alternatives with lower levels of revenue loss and the prospect of potentially getting federal assistance. Slide 6. Yeah, well, let's skip 6 and go to 7. So recently, the California Legislative Analyst gave testimony to the state Senate, and his assessment of our situation is pretty well summarized on this slide. We're in a recession now. It's going to impact at least the current fiscal year and next year. In terms of the state, they are going to very likely exhaust their state reserves, and that is going to be the case for local government as well. He talked in terms of the shape of the recession being either a U-shaped or L-shaped, depending on the trajectory of the virus and what happens in the economy writ large. Best case, the restrictions are lifted and everything starts rebounding in terms of economic activity. The worst case are that the restrictions linger, or that there is a second or third wave of the virus causing more shutdowns, or just that the businesses are slow to hire back because out of an abundance of caution, or because we're all forming new habits, and some of those habits are going to lead to changes in economic activity that affect taxes. And he concluded saying that the degree and effectiveness of the federal stimulus is going to be key to mitigation, as well as whether or not any of that money finds its way to the state and local government and can be used to offset revenue losses as opposed to emergency-related expenses. Slide 8. So you've been following the headlines, and you know that we've had over 20 million new unemployment claims just in the last month, completely shattering past highs. If you look at the chart on the left, it shows the worst 4-week period in the prior 6 recessions. And in the worst 4-week period, there were, 2 million or so unemployment claims filed. And we've blown right through that. The last 4 weeks, we're at 22 million. So clearly, that is different than any other recession we've had in memory. In terms of retail sales, they plunged a record 8.7% in March. That was more than double the biggest one-month decline during the Great Recession. And that obviously has a big impact on the sales tax, which is a major revenue source for cities in California. Slide 9. I've listed here some excerpts from one of the consulting firms, Hitterleiter Delamas, who is one of the sales tax consultants in the state and nationally. And these are excerpts from their April 2020 sales tax forecast. It's actually the third version because events changed so quickly. They've had to update it twice just in the last couple of weeks. But you can see some big numbers there as you look in the different categories for both the first and the second quarter, declines from the same quarter of the prior year. And a lot of these, autos down 55%, gas stations down 50%, restaurants and hotels down 60%. The one bright spot is the state and county pools, and we have the good fortune of the Wayfair decision regarding online sales having come through and finally getting implemented, and lo and behold, there's more money coming in than had been expected by most analysts. So that's good. It's kind of getting lost in the background noise, but there are definitely major losses occurring right now in terms of taxable sales. Slide 10. In addition, the travel industry is reeling. You've got most travel, business and personal, severely restricted. Most hotel rooms are vacant. The travel industry projects a $400 billion decline in spending in the U.S., which with a multiplier effect, they get up to $910 billion in economic output. That's 7 times the impact of 9/11. The travel sector revenue is going to average 78% below normal in March and April. You can see from the chart they're expecting things to gradually improve throughout the year. However, losses will continue throughout the year. And again, this is kind of a best case scenario that things start coming back together. It doesn't make an allowance for a resurgence of COVID-19. Okay, slide 11. And you can skip to slide 12. So we're going to start looking at the COVID-19 recession forecast for Santa Rosa. What you're looking at now is just if you were looking at my live model, you would see this as a control panel or dashboard. It shows the two main charts, annual shortfall and ultimate fund balance, assuming there were no corrective actions. And as you can see, there's a lot of bad news there. The chart on the left is really, it's a story of, it's actually two different stories of economic distress. The first is because of COVID-19 recession, and that's what happens between now and, say, 2025. And then right about that time is when you start losing sales taxes. And so the latter, bigger lump of shortfall is attributable to losing the two general fund sales taxes and then also losing the special tax, but having the general fund pick up the costs that are currently being charged to that special revenue fund. So that's a fairly daunting prospect. The revenue loss we're projecting, which I'll show you in a moment, $74 million. You can go through this dashboard and click on a variety of assumptions and instantly get a new reaction as to what the impact on the city is. So at a point when we are in a position to show you the live model, we can go through pretty quickly and run new scenarios for you on the fly. But we're going to talk a little more about revenue loss now. So let's go to slide 13.
Mayor, can I interrupt you really briefly?
Sure.
I should have said this in the beginning. John or Victoria, if you have any questions, just go ahead. It's 44 slides, so if you have a question on any of the slides, just go ahead and do it while we're doing it because there's so much information. So, Bob, if you'd be open to interruption by any of the council members, I appreciate that.
That's fine. Let's do what's most effective here. Okay, so on slide 13, this is a picture of the revenue loss. You can see from the bottom line that's your L shape, kind of a lazy L with a long bottom tail. That's what happens when you have losses for 2 years. We're expecting the total loss in 21 to be higher than in 20, but then it begins improving as it moves toward ultimately catching up with the upper green line, which is the revenue without the recession. All of this is compared to the red line, which is expenditures. So you can see out towards 26 and 27, even the revenue without the recession tails off. And that's because we're assuming that the sales tax is sunset. And at the same time, you can see the expenditures surge. Well, that's because of picking up the obligation for the special tax for police and fire that is in the other fund. And so we're assuming the general fund backfills that obligation. So you have the combination long-term of higher expenditures and lower revenue. But the highlight in yellow is the expected revenue loss over this period. It's $74 million. Now, we'll walk through this initial shock that we've received, which maybe in some respects is analogous to 9/11 in that it happened quickly, but it's going to have a much longer impact overall. We're also going to take a look at COVID-19 compared to the Great Recession. And while the Great Recession had different factors driving it, that is the most significant adverse impact that we've had on the economy within our recent memory. And so there is a useful comparison there to provide context. Let's go to slide 14. Now, the revenue impacts are going to vary quite a bit by source. Not all revenues are affected the same way, or some aren't affected at all. Part of that is the different collection periods that determine timing of loss, and the other is just the nature of what's being taxed. So there at the top on property tax, that's based on value. It's not based on transactions. So there are different factors that come into play as to whether or not values change, and especially whether values are lowered far enough to put them below the artificially low Prop 13 values that absent new construction or change in ownership, are basically limited to 2% growth a year. So we're not looking at an impact on property tax, anything like the Great Recession. And it will be delayed in any event because there's an annual lien date of January 1. The current taxes were set as of January of 2019, and January of 2020, which was before all this happened, is going to determine the property taxes for the fiscal 2021 year. Now, that second category, the sales tax, hotel tax, property transfer tax, that's an area of immediate losses. Those are all transaction-based. Property or the business license tax is also transaction-based in the sense that it's based on gross receipts, but the timing is different in that it's collected once a year at the beginning, basically January and February. And so that's done for the current fiscal year. There aren't going to be any losses there. But it will be a different story this time next year because there will be businesses that went out of business. There will be many reporting much lower gross receipts than they would have. So there will be an impact, but delayed. Utility users tax, franchise tax, and I threw cannabis in here as well. We're not envisioning a significant impact there. Some have suggested that perhaps under the circumstances, cannabis tax may be higher. There's also the issue of utility users tax. More people are spending time at home, so they're probably generating more utility services at home, but offsetting that is that there are businesses that are not generating services that they used to do. The franchise payments are, month to month for waste, but for like PG&E, it's a year in arrears. So again, there's timing differences. For recreation and fee-based programs, there's an immediate loss there. And other revenue, including intergovernmental, that is subject to a variety of factors. It's harder to tell at this point what the impacts on that are going to be. So we have not projected impacts for other revenue at this particular point. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into the nature of your revenues. Let's go to slide 15.
Before you move on, a quick question on the property tax. Are you expecting, or is anyone expecting any significant effects on the potential default on property tax?
Not like the Great Recession. We're going to be there in 2 more slides. So I think what I will do, I'll have a picture to show you at that point, and it'll make it easier to respond to that question.
Okay, thank you.
So this slide is taking a look at cash flow, and it's very elementary. It's not designed to be scientific to the last dollar. It's taking a representation of the major revenue sources and showing you during the course of the fiscal year when they come in. So sales taxes, for example, will vary a little bit from month to month, but we're just showing it even here for the sake of getting the point across, which is that sales taxes are advanced by the state monthly. There's a settlement every quarter. When you get to a situation like we had in the Great Recession where revenues were lower, the state lowered the advances. So you start realizing the impact quickly, and now there's the extra wrinkle of the state saying that smaller businesses can delay payment of the tax, which is going to be a cash flow hit. The TOT is paid quarterly, but so it doesn't come in for most businesses any sooner than every 90 days. There's also been talk in various cities of delaying when the TOT needs to be paid. Real property transfer tax is collected by the county and remitted monthly, so that's an immediate impact. We mentioned business license being in January and February. And then these fee-based programs and building permits, those are certainly not even throughout the course of the year, but it is a pay-as-you-go type of revenue source. Now, even during the Great Recession, as bad as that was, people, if they chose, could still come to recreation programs and there wasn't much new construction, so they weren't pulling a lot of building permits, but there were still recreation programs. They weren't shut down. People don't have the choice of attending them now. So that is one of those areas of immediate impact. Utility user tax is also paid monthly. And this yellow section is really, as opposed to individual transactions, it's more a function of occupancy and overall levels of service usage. And so that we would expect to be pretty stable over time. It was not as stable back during the Great Recession because there were people who had defaults on their homes. They were foreclosed on, and you had a lot of vacant properties, and those vacant properties were not generating any utility services. So that was an impact. And cable service, telephone, that might have been cut back just because of the stress on people's income. Now, the value-based property tax largely comes in a couple of times a year. As I mentioned, it's subject to determination at a lien date that precedes it by a year or so. And therefore, any kind of impacts on the property tax are going to probably hit primarily in the 21-22 fiscal year. Then in terms of intergovernmental and other revenue, the timing and risk of loss varies quite a bit there. You can see basically about $600,000 a month is what comes in from those sources. And then last is you have the internal type of payments, transfers in from other funds, interfund charges. Those are things that are determined by the city directly as opposed to outside customers. In terms of the overall magnitude, you can see that the transaction-based revenues are about half of the total revenue that you have. So right off the bat, half the revenue the city has is more at risk immediately from the kind of downturn that we're seeing. Just under 25% is the value-based, which is property tax, and then the remaining quarter or so of revenue is everything else, which is a little more stable. So you've got a half subject to immediate impact and pretty severe. You've got about a quarter that was hit back during the Great Recession, but we're really not expecting it to get hit now, property tax, and there'll be some delay in any event if it is hit, and then roughly a quarter with a lower risk of being lost. So let's go to slide 16. We'll take another perspective on this. This is now looking at the Great Recession and the revenues that Santa Rosa lost at that time by the same types. Now, what we had to do is go back and create what we think is a reasonable level of revenues that would have been collected had the Great Recession not happened. So obviously that's a bit of a matter of judgment, but given how we've seen revenues perform over the long term and where we're projecting them to go now, we came up with what we felt was a pretty reasonable estimate of what revenue growth would have been, and then compared the amount by which the various taxes were below that level in each year to come up with this chart. And you can see that the transaction-based taxes led the way in terms of losses. That was the most of what was lost in the first couple of years were sales tax, TOT, business tax, and the property transfer tax. You see the blue area comes in. That's the loss from the property tax, and there wasn't much of that in the beginning. But then by year 3, it started up. And so you can see what really happened is that during the Great Recession, Santa Rosa and every other city we've analyzed so far lost revenue for 4 years in a row. It kept getting worse. If you remember back to that time, the first year was bad, and everybody thought, oh, boy, it can't be worse than that. And then the second year, it was worse. And then the third year, it was worse. And the fourth year, it was worse. And what really drove the third year and some of the fourth was loss in property tax. The assessor started downgrading property values. You wound up with Prop 8 kicking in, which is that if your true market value is less than your restricted Prop 13 value, then your value has to go down to the true market value. Ultimately, it can go up without respect to the 2% annual growth limit, but that resulted in a big hit on the property tax. And so you can see we have that layer of loss. And it took a number of years for that to begin to go away. And then a very small impact, yellow, was utility user tax. There were some losses, but it wasn't a major contributor. And then by the time you got to the fourth year, these wild card tax, other revenues, and they varied all over the board, not least of which were intergovernmental, but also interest income, various fines and forfeitures and the like. Those began to suffer by year 4. And so you wound up with, in that year, about a $27 million shortfall compared to where the city could have reasonably expected to have been had it not been for the recession. So you have 4 years of things getting progressively worse, and then you have about 6 years that it took to actually recover. There is a red line on that chart which shows the total net loss, and it differs a little bit in the beginning and the end because in the early years, the loss was mitigated somewhat by transferring money in from other funds, but that was temporary. And then at the tail end, there were some factors that changed, and that was in large part, there was a large insurance reimbursement from the Tubbs fire that occurred in 2018. But that's the profile of the Great Recession. So let's go to 17. So what we've done here is taken the loss in the Great Recession and looked at it in a different realm, which is the percentage reduction below the pre-recession forecast. And there you see this profile a little more clearly, where the city lost about 4.5% the first year, jumped up to just under 12%, then about 16%, then almost 19%, and then steadily improved from there on out. So that's the Great Recession profile. You look on the right, and here's our projection of the COVID-19. Now, if you look in year 1 of COVID-19, it's a 6.2% loss, so it's actually higher than what the Great Recession was. And year 2 is about as high, a little bit less, at 10.4%. And then we're showing a 4-year recovery. So the main reason why the COVID-19 percentages aren't higher is because, as I mentioned before, we're not believing that the property tax is going to be as involved in terms of losses this time. That was what continued, that's what made the Great Recession loss grow in year 3 and 4. And we're not seeing that here at this time. And so the hope is that we peak next year, which hopefully will be a combination of revenue loss and recovery, and then recovery over the ensuing 4 years. In the chart at the right, you see a 0% in 25-26, and we are assuming that everything is back to normal at that point. So that gives you a sense of what was then and what is now. Let's next slide, 18. This is a chart that is part of the model. Without getting into a lot of the detail of how the model works, you are basically able to select a degree of magnitude of loss in each fiscal year for this year, next year, and the year after. And you can pick between no loss at all on up to a severe level of loss. And then there's ways that you can adjust that by individual revenue source. So it's fairly granular, as they say. It gives you the ability to look at individual sources and each year and tailor the perceived outcome of this recession, not just with sort of a blunt instrument, oh, everything's down 10%. You can play with it and adjust it based on what you see happening on the ground. So this is the basis for us coming up with the individual losses. And you see the percentages here for the major groups. I'm going to very quickly now go through those individual groups and give you the same kind of comparison that we were just looking at on a citywide basis. So let's go to slide 19. So here's the property tax. And again, you can see how it grew in impact, greater and greater and greater impact, and it was worse in years 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and finally began improving by the time we got to, say, 2015, 2016. We are showing some loss for the property tax this time, but not near as much. And that is going to basically hinge on whether the larger economic forces at work are going to start driving down home prices, which have, in many cases, exceeded the pre-Great Recession level peak of home value. And so that is a major concern. The property tax is about 22% of general fund revenues. So if we're wrong on this, this is a source that could result in significantly higher revenue loss than the impact shown here if we have understated it. Slide 20 is the sales tax, shows the same thing. Now, the impact we're showing in the first 2 years of COVID-19 is higher than the impact on the sales tax back during the Great Recession. And I think that makes sense. Again, the quarter we're in right now is a wipeout for all except online purchases and grocery stores. It's difficult to do the level of shopping that we had in the past. And that will probably slide over into next year for certain. And then we're showing a 4-year recovery from that. Now, again, the sales tax is 31% of general fund revenues. So, again, the risk factor is higher if we're off. And as I indicated, a major mitigating factor is the fact that the Wayfair decision is leading to higher online revenues. And so we're getting that at a very fortuitous time. Slide 21.
This is John again. I'm going to interrupt you. I'm going to have you go slip back to the property tax again. And I keep asking about this only because I'm concerned with fallout, future fallout. And unless the government comes in and props up some of these people's ability to pay their property tax, is it because it's a few years out that most people that have lost their jobs potentially will have gained those jobs back, and their ability to pay their property tax will recover enough so that our fiscal condition wouldn't be affected at the end of the day by their inability to pay?
Yeah, there's sort of two angles to that. One is just assuming the tax is paid, anything that affects values, there's a couple of year delay. So in terms of the values going down, the city wouldn't see that until basically the 21-22 fiscal year. Now, in terms of the ability for a homeowner to pay, the tax is due in the 2 increments, and many have it withheld, impounded, as part of their mortgage payment monthly. And so there is a question as to whether they will be in a position of not being able to pay. The property tax, there's a lien period and a 5-year process for ultimately enforcing foreclosures if all you haven't paid is the property tax. What happened during the Great Recession is people couldn't pay the mortgage either. And so the banks are much quicker in terms of foreclosing than the county is on the property tax. So you had impacts immediately because of that. Now, the thing that's back during the Great Recession, the job losses were more structural. There were problems in various industries that were affecting people's ability to purchase, and it became a feedback loop where the more that happened, the more people lost jobs, and the more people that lost jobs, there was less money out there to buy these goods and services. And so that the housing problems just grew. They didn't manifest on day one. It took a few years to happen. And what the difference now is, I mean, the unemployment is stratospheric compared to how those other recessions started out. But the prospect is there that the recovery could be quicker because the underlying weakness in the economy that existed during 2008, 2009, and the collapse of the housing market then, that isn't present now. But I do think that it makes sense that a lot of businesses will be very cautious about hiring people back because they don't want to be in a yo-yo effect of bring people back and lay them off again. And they don't want to bring back people before their markets reestablish themselves and people are willing to pay for their goods and services. There is the federal stimulus. It's a little hard to say at this point where that money is going and how much of it trickles down to the smallest of the small businesses that make up so much of any given community. To the extent that that money is available or there are other programs that give loans, that might make it quicker for those businesses to come back, and they will be rehiring some of those people that own the homes that you're worried about, will they be able to make the payments? I don't believe even during the Great Recession, during the Great Recession, there were some federal programs to try to help certain people who found themselves with loans that were underwater. And I haven't heard whether there's anything in store like that. I would say probably not yet because there hasn't been a major sign of collapse in the housing market. That might be something for further down the line. Right now, they're concerned about stimulus for individuals and businesses to try to keep payrolls together and to give people some disposable income to spend. And, we'll see how that works out.
Great. Thank you very much.
Sure. Okay, so let's go to slide 20. No, wait a minute. I think we were on 20. Okay, let's see. Yeah, 21. Slide 21, Transient Occupancy Tax. One of the things that surprised us as we did this for cities around the state was how much the TO tax was affected back during the Great Recession. You didn't really hear about that much, but I think the reality is that in any major recession, people stop traveling for pleasure because they don't want to spend the disposable income, and they stop traveling for business either because business is bad or, again, they're just trying to conserve resources. So either way hits the transient occupancy tax. Now, the big change right now is that a lot of things are closed. I mean, if you're the city of Anaheim and, Disneyland is closed and about half of your income as a city comes from Disneyland, you're in a world of hurt. There is obviously the wine country tourism that Santa Rosa is part of. But you've got places closed, so it isn't a matter of disposable income to spend. People just aren't coming. And so it would not be surprising to see a loss from the TO tax now exceeding what happened during the Great Recession. We are showing the impact as being comparable, a little higher the first year, just a tad lower the second year. And then, again, ramping down for the next 4 years. I think one consideration for tourism in the kind of the North Coast, Sonoma County region is that, it's not Disneyland. So it's not thousands and thousands of people going to the same spot every day and that's what they came for. Wine tasting is a little bit, more smaller groups, individuals, couples, you're more dispersed. It may be, hopefully, that when things begin improving, people will think, well, I want to avoid large crowds, but, you know, a nice trip to the wine country might be okay. So let's hope that we see less of an impact in that regard. But right now, we're assuming basically 80% of 1 quarter's worth of revenue is lost in the current year, and that will spill over to the future. It's only 3% of total general fund revenue, so there's not as big an exposure if we're high or low on our estimate in this particular area. Slide 22 is business license tax. Again, a pretty big impact in prior years. We're expecting a sizable impact, not in year one because that's in the bank already, but next fiscal year there should be an impact, and then it would fade out, and you again see the comparison to the Great Recession. About 2% of general fund revenues are from the business tax. Okay, slide 23, real property transfer tax. Kind of interesting when you look at the Great Recession. It did start off bad and then suddenly got pretty good. So there were properties being sold, and you remember that even as values were down, there were a lot of people taking advantage of the lower prices, speculators and homeowners alike, that were acquiring properties when the value was down. So that's kind of reflected in the fact that the real property transfer tax by the 12-13 fiscal year actually was ahead of the forecast pre-recession. We are, again, assuming about 80% of 1 quarter's revenue is lost this year. Same thing, spillover effect, and then a 4-year recovery. I am kind of surprised, though, at how many realty ads and people I see running around the neighborhoods going to open houses and things that you kind of expected weren't happening. But I think people are looking at houses both virtually and then coming by for what hopefully is a social distancing walkthrough. But there are some sales that are occurring. Okay, slide 24. That is the community development fees, licenses, building permits. Again, you can see the hit was really hard during the Great Recession, and that's because there just wasn't any new construction. So the impact then was greater than what we're showing now. And, there's a possibility that things won't be quite as bad as what we're showing here. And we do have some alternatives that will show you the impact of a lesser hit on revenues. But the dynamic going on in Santa Rosa is you have the fire rebuilds, and so you have a different type of motivation. You have people who've reached insurance settlements and people that want to get a home rebuilt to rejoin their neighborhood, as opposed to homes being built maybe more spec homes or in subdivisions for future residents. And so we're showing some impact, but it's not as bad, we believe, as what happened during the Great Recession. Okay, slide 25. Park and rec fees. And that's kind of a different situation. As I said before, there was an impact, but back in the Great Recession, it was more related to disposable income. And then by the time you get to 17, 18, and 18, 19, you have a rather anomalous effect, which probably has more to do with local issues than the recession. But going back to the 08, 9, 10, 11 years, people had less income, so they stopped participating in functions. The difference now is that even if they have the income, they can't do it because the programs are shut down. So again, there'll be an impact this year, pretty much a quarter's worth wiped out. We're expecting lingering effect due to just the concern about people joining larger groups. Some of the habits that we're forming right now, I think, are going to carry over. People are going to be less likely to join some of these. And if there's any kind of recurrence of the virus during flu season, that's going to be another whammy to have to get through. So again, as I said, next fiscal year, there are 12 months in which something can go wrong, as opposed to this year where there was only about 3.5 months. Okay, slide 26. slide 26 is just everything else. And as I'd said before, there are a lot of different factors at play here. It's difficult to forecast in this area. We have minimal losses, mostly related to fines, assuming activities that lead to fines and forfeitures are going to be cut back. Okay, slide 27. Okay, now we're going to take a look at some other factors affecting the forecast. These were present during our first draft of the forecast back in December, but there are a few changes now. So let's go to slide 28. I call this the twin legacies of the Great Recession, a revenue gap and a wage gap. The chart on the left shows on the red line, the pre-recession trend, and then the blue is actual. And you can see from 2001 through 2008, the revenue per capita for the general fund tracked pretty closely to this trend line, which if you continue it out and then compare it to what happened since, well, you can see the plunge in 08, 09, 10 when we hit bottom, and that gap that was created. And so now the gap is slowly getting closed, and the measures P and O help, but there's still a gap. And this is present in almost every jurisdiction in the state that we've looked at. So there simply is a more difficult situation for the city trying to provide services to future residents at the level that they were able to do in prior years, certainly prior to the Great Recession. And now, with a new recession starting up, these numbers, a new gap is going to form. If you take a look at the right-hand chart, it's different. It's the average annual pay of all California local government employees. So this isn't specific to Santa Rosa or the Northern California region. It's the whole state. And so you take a look at the pre-recession trend, how closely reality matched that right up until the Great Recession. And then one way of coping was not to give cost of living increases. And so a gap developed. It's pretty much increases are moving parallel to the prior trend, but not really closing that gap. And certainly new hires pretty much since 2013 have the lower Public Employees Pension Reform Act level benefits. And those PEPRA people, really the main way that they could recover the level of retirement income that they might have had before was to have higher wages because they're not going to get it through a higher benefit level. So those are pressures that are facing virtually every agency, the wage gap and the revenue gap. So let's talk just a couple of minutes on pension. The chart, go to slide 29. So on slide 29, what it shows is the CalPERS investment return from 1992 to the present. And you can see that blue line goes up and down and up and down. The idea is that the rate of return will be equal to the discount rate. And the discount rate is that magenta colored line, which actually has slowly gone down over the last 30 years or so as the general decline in investment return has gone down. And you can see from the green dotted line, that's the trend line for investment returns. And there's a variety of reasons for that. In any one recession, as you can see in 08 and 09, there were big revenue losses. And we will have investment return loss, rather. And we will have another investment return loss this year. We're not sure yet exactly what that amount is going to be. At one point, it was down 17%, another time down 5%. It will be down. And when it goes down, that is going to increase the costs to local agencies and the state because 2/3 of the income that CalPERS gets comes from investments. And when they get less than they expected on investments, there's only the remaining third to get the losses out of to compensate. And that last third is employer and employee contributions. And the employee contributions are pretty much fixed. So all you've got on the side of the employer is the requirement that they pay more to make up the difference. And so we see over the past several years, a steady rise in the unfunded liability portion of the rates charged by CalPERS. So we know that's going to go down. So slide 30. This shows you the CalPERS rates historically and where we see them going based on the latest forecast from last year that CalPERS gave, and then taking into account some other factors such as the transition from classic to PEPRA benefits, which will happen over about the next 15 years. Assuming a lower discount rate over time, we're assuming the 7% drops to 6% over 20 years. And then we've assumed in the near term some losses and gains over the next couple of years. This particular scenario assumes a 5% negative return, but in terms of the investment loss for fiscal 20, typically a loss is followed by a gain, so we're assuming a 12% gain in fiscal 21, and then after just over 6% increase. And so that's going to produce the level of general fund pension costs that you see on the right-hand side. So by 2031, costs will have risen about 66% from fiscal year 20 levels. At that point, you see the costs begin to taper off, largely because a sufficient amount of unfunded liability has been paid off in these amortization bases. Once they're paid off, it's like a mortgage. You've got one for 30 years or 20 years. Once that's paid, it's gone. And so the costs will begin dipping over time as you're left with mainly normal costs to be paid, which are the pay-as-you-go amounts, rather than the unfunded liability from what you should have collected but weren't able to in prior years. Okay, so let's go to
do we have,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Do we have estimates? Do we have estimates in what those costs might be in those the near out? Well, actually, the costs get considerably higher in those way out years, which are probably hard to prove, I guess. So I'm trying to think of how will our fiscal model be hit in those out years when we start to have to make up the difference for CalPERS? Okay.
Well, the first thing is there is a built-in delay. Anything that CalPERS loses between the beginning of the year and June 30 of this year, so that'll be for the fiscal year 20 investments, those will not be reflected in rates charged to local government until fiscal 23. So that's the fiscal year that starts July of 22 and ends in June of 23. So there's a 3-year delay right off the bat. And so that's the first thing, is there'll be some delay. In terms of what the rates become, each year that that CalPERS is lower than their investment expectation, there is a debit amortization base created. So that's where you're going to owe them over the next 20 years. And every time they exceed, there is a credit amortization base, and they actually give you credit each year. And all of those bases overlap each other and add up to the total obligation that you would see in the right-hand chart here. So we, compared to now, the forecast that CalPERS put out last year assumed a 7% discount rate ongoing. and assumed a 7% rate of return ongoing. So that was considerably rosier than what we're showing here. So we are being a bit pessimistic in that we're assuming that the discount rate will continue to drop. We have it in even increments over 20 years. But I got to tell you, given what's happening with investments right now, CalPERS may feel that they have to go to a lower discount rate sooner than 20 years. And so one way that the forecast could be off is that they will lower the discount rate sooner. And when they do that, a lower discount rate costs you more money up front and it saves you in the long run. But frankly, if you're a city, you're more concerned about the short run because something that is going to save you money in 15 to 20 years, that's nice. But what's happening, in the next 5, 6, 7 years is probably of greater importance.
Right.
But we are pessimistic in the sense that we are assuming a drop. And so some of this cost if they start lowering the discount rate, we have already anticipated some of that. And we've already anticipated some of the lower investment return over time. Now, if between now and June 30, things really go bad and they've got a 20 or 25% investment loss, then that is going to be significantly worse than what I'm showing here. When you go back to that prior slide, you can see, in fact, Lisa, can you go back to slide 29 for just a second? So you can see the amount. They're actually listed in red there. And most years, even when there were recessions, a lot of the losses were when the investment return wasn't even below zero. It was just below the positive number that was the assumed discount rate. So if you're assuming a 7% discount rate and you get a 5% rate of return, that's actually a 2 percentage point loss, even though 5% is a positive number. It's just not as high as 7%, which is what they're counting on. The worst impacts were in the .com bust, when you had a couple of years in a row of 6-7% negative. And then there were 2 years during the Great Recession, a 5% negative, and then a whopping 24% negative in 2009. But again, that was with a major collapse of the financial system and banking and housing, which is not happening now. So I think we're more in the realm of a loss of 5% to maybe a 0% return by the time all is said and done.
Well, I appreciate your being conservative because I trust CalPERS' ability to forecast about as far as I can throw them, and their crystal ball has been very, very foggy in the last 10 years. So I think that going on the conservative side makes a lot of sense, and you're probably right. Given history, you're probably the picture may be painted even a little more rosy than it actually will be, but I'll take it.
Okay. The nice thing about the model is it is very adaptable. You can plug in new assumptions, so it's not a take it or leave it kind of thing. So let's see, we were on slide 30, so let's go to slide 31. So I just want to touch briefly on housing development. The chart on the left in the green and red shows you new housing units and rebuild units. And this one is based on when we're assuming the permit is issued. That's the basis for the green, which is the new housing units. And then for rebuild units, we have both year of issuing permits, and then in the little box below, we have an estimate of when they'll actually be finalized by calendar year. And that estimate actually comes from your planning staff. So there's a little over 3,000 units to be rebuilt. Their assumption is that they will all be built and finalized by 2024. Now, the city's new units in the green really have not met their regional housing needs allocation, and that's actually pretty much the case for most cities, in recent years. I have a chart there that shows, or a table that shows the RHNA goal, the annual average under the goal, what the cities actually built for those two prior periods, what the annual average was. So leading up to 2006, actually the city did pretty well. The annual average would have been 957 and they built 1,041. So they were actually at 109% of their goal. But that was before the Great Recession. Since then, the first reallocation from 2007 to 14 anticipated 817 units a year, and only 319 a year got built. And the current allocation is about 565 units a year, which is less than the last two allocations. So I think it's more realistic in that regard. But the question is, how much is going to be built? The 2035 general plan was looking at about 24,000 new units, and that is about 800 units a year. And that 800 units a year is about double what we have projected on an ongoing basis. So it remains to be seen once we get through that load of rebuild units, and that's just putting back together units that used to be there. So in terms of new units, we'll see what the market is for that and whether this recession cools that. So there may be some fall off. But I would say that 400 is a pretty good middle of the road estimate for housing growth. If you were to get up towards 600 to 800, that's getting close to your general plan level. And just under 600 is what the RENA allocation is. And so that would be on the high side. And then the low side would look a lot more like what a lot of the prior 10 years has looked like, which is kind of in the 200 unit range. So, there was some pretty good growth in 18 and 19, at least in terms of permits that were issued. So we'll see how that goes in the future. But the model has assumptions built in on both the rebuild and the new unit side. So let's go to slide 32. So this is on the issue of deferred maintenance. In the Bay Area, the 9 counties have good information on pavement condition index, and it's all organized by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and it all comes down to this one chart you see, which is like a 4 portions of a chart where it shows in green, the upper right-hand corner, are cities with improving conditions and smooth roads, and opposite that, in the lower left-hand corner, is declining conditions and rougher roads. So here's Santa Rosa, unfortunately, in the that lower left category. And it has, at the time that this was run, which was 2018, had a PCI reported as being equal to 60, compared to the Bay Area average of 67, which is this vertical blue line. So obviously, everybody would like to be in this upper right-hand corner. And there was some concern there for a while that the SB1 gas tax might be lost, but it survived an electoral challenge. So we've got some ongoing more revenues dedicated to that. And just as we were looking at the prospect for good growth in those areas, along comes this current recession, which is going to have an adverse impact on gas taxes and the rehabilitation and maintenance fund. So this is just a thing to keep in mind, which is that the PCI is on the low side. Ideally, for sustainability over the long term, you'd like to see that improved. But if you're going to put money into it above and beyond the gas tax, then you're either going to need statewide, you're going to need countywide transportation tax sources, or you're going to need the general fund, or you're going to need bond sale. So none of those are easy sells for different reasons, but I just put that in as background. So let's go to slide 33, and then this is going to be the last one before we get into the actual forecast summary. So this is a recap of your fund balance over the last 10 years or so. And it shows total fund balance, the bold figure at the top, and that's doubled over time. From the beginning of the Great Recession to now, it's grown from 33 million to 66. So that is good. Where it has grown largely is in this carryover of appropriations, which you read across. It was nothing the first few years and then began growing, and it's at 39 million for the last CAFR. And so that means that of that 66 million, 40 million is spoken for based on prior council actions. Now, some of that is for projects that had been approved but not moved forward. So to the extent that you're not contractually committed, you've actually got flexibility in deciding whether you want to take some of that 39 million and add it down here into the yellow section, which is the unassigned balance. And that largely is not much changed from where you were in 2007. I mean, you can see in 2007-8, it was about $24 million. Now you've got 26. It's gone up and down in the intervening years. The unassigned balance is the shock absorber after taking into account your annual revenues and expenditures, and then anything that's earmarked for any other fund balance purpose. What's left is the unassigned balance. And so the 26.4 million is 14.5% of total expense. Ideally, you'd like that to be higher. It could be higher, except there's a lot of money tied up in the carryover of appropriations. And that's just something you're going to have to dig through with staff on a sort of project by project and department by department basis. But what we're looking at as a starter is the 26 million that's right here. And so when we now turn our attention to what the different scenarios look like, it's this unassigned balance and the change in that we're taking a look at. So let's move through slide 34 on to the next one, which is slide 35. And there we go. All right, so slide 35 shows you 4 sets of alternatives. And so each of the charts is a little bit small. They're bigger in the ensuing slides, but what I wanted to do is take this opportunity to compare them all on the same scale to each other. And so on the top row is the revenue loss. And so we spoke before about the baseline forecast being a $74 million loss, and the yellow portion of that shows up pretty well. So you can see that you've got an L-shaped recovery that is elongated because we're assuming it takes 4 years after fiscal 21 to catch back up with where we were before. Now, alternative 1 is basically half the loss. So we're assuming that it's not as severe an impact in fiscal 21 and that we recover sooner. So less of a loss, that's $38 million. Now notice that we're in the same position in fiscal 20 because that's not going to change. I mean, if we have less of a loss for Santa Rosa, that's going to be a function of fiscal 21, fiscal 22, fiscal 23. The future years are where that savings or the reduction in loss is going to wind up being. Then alternative 2 is a $28 million loss, and it assumes that things recover very promptly and that by fiscal 22 we're caught up. And that's probably not as realistic. And then you get over to the right-hand side, and you have the original baseline forecast with a twist, and that is assuming we get $23 million in federal aid, which is $130 per capita. Now, I don't have any special knowledge or crystal ball on this. There have been various discussions about receiving aid on the basis of per capita because that would be a fairly straightforward way to do it. But so far, the only agencies getting direct amounts are from the from the federal government are populations of 500,000 and over. There's still a possibility that there may be money filtered through the state that would be on a per capita or other basis. But, the real problem right now for cities is, yes, there have been emergency-related expenditures. It's a different type of emergency than a massive fire or a massive earthquake or tornado. But in that case, you've got the areas that aren't damaged are open for business. The parts that are damaged are shut down, but you have emergency expenditures. Here, it's more like you've just lost revenue, and you've lost it citywide. And so there has to be a point at which aid is recognizing the fact that revenue has been lost, and you've got to be able to receive money on that basis of lost revenue, really in the same way that small businesses are getting money to make up for the fact that they have a period of time where there's no income coming in. And that's true for local government as well. So that the thing about the federal aid is there's no guarantee we're going to get it. And actually, you can see the anomalous effect in fiscal 20 where the revenues with recession are actually higher than it would be with if we didn't have the problem. And so that seems odd, that you get a windfall. But if you got as much as $23 million and you got it in the next couple of months, it actually would be a windfall, assuming you got to keep it. So that's a big unknown. We'll have to continue to look at that. In terms of the middle band is basically the shortfall in each year, and you can see that there's the tale of two losses. The fiscal 20 through 25 is basically the recessionary loss, and that will get smaller in alternate 1, for example, and alternate 2, where there's less loss up front. But the latter loss from the sunsetting of the sales taxes, that's a given in each case. The only way to resolve that is to get those particular taxes to be made permanent, and that's going to take a vote of the people. And then at the bottom, to kind of focus a little more on just the next 10 years, is the resulting general fund balance. And not that under any circumstance would you be allowed to go negative, but just for the sake of comparison, it shows what those shortfalls would lead to in terms of the outcome. And you can see, they're all bad. It's just that the alternative 2 stretches the balance out furthest, so it gives you the more time in which to craft a solution. So obviously, losing less revenue, as indicated in the alternate 2, is a good thing in terms of time you have to get going. On the other hand, from our vantage point right now, you don't know that that's how that's going to turn out. What I think you really have to plan for is the baseline forecast, because if things are going to be bad, you won't be afforded the extra time to come up with a solution. You'll need to start working on it now. So that's kind of the conundrum that all cities find themselves in right now. You could make a case that the economy will recover quicker and that you'll have something more like alternate 2. But if that doesn't happen, you're going to be deep into bad problems, before you get there. And so you need to start thinking now about how to correct. So the remaining slides.
Bob, I have a quick question. Just for this is Tom, by the way. So each of the forecasts, and my concern that if people see this, like the first baseline forecast, 74 million revenue loss, that's over the course of 6 or 7 years cumulative. And alternative number 1, it's just the yellow time frame, right? So alternative 2, that's a $28 million revenue loss over 4 years?
Yeah. Alternate 2 is is actually 28 million loss over 3 years, and alternate 1 is 38 million loss over 4 years.
Okay, and the 74 million revenue loss is over, what's that, 7 years?
6, yeah. By fiscal 27, you're back to normal.
Okay. It's just, yeah, they kind of struck in first when I saw that 74 million. I'm like, that's an annual loss, but that's cumulative over that time frame. Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. So the remaining slides just give you more of a close-up look at the same thing. I'm not going to take the time to go through there right now. I know you've had some opportunity to ask questions, but I think, Mr. Mayor, at this point, you could solicit other questions that people may have, and I'd be happy to respond.
All right, thank you for that. Yes, there is a plethora of information there, and I am very impressed, although it's not happy news. The depth of detail in the information here is impressive. So I'll start with either Vice Mayor Fleming or Councilmember Story. Do you have any additional questions about the information that we've received thus far?
I do have a lot of questions, but I'm gonna defer to you guys because I know I don't have any more childcare, so I'm just gonna listen in on mute. Let's not cause a distraction.
Vice Mayor Ryan, I have no other questions. So if you want to take a stab at it, by all means.
No, it's okay. I don't have anything specific on at the moment, but I do appreciate the detail of the presentation, and
Agreed.
Appreciative for all the work that you guys have put into this.
Thank you.
Okay, then I'll just go to Alan or Bob. Did you need any specific directions? I know when I talked to the city manager who had to leave the call or the meeting, it was just more information for us. Did you need any information from this ad hoc? And then if you can just confirm when this will be coming to the entire council?
Yeah. So, Tom, this is Alan. No, we're fine. This was just a presentation. It's informational. So there's nothing left to you but to absorb all this, which is a yeoman's task at itself. But we will be going to the full council with this in study session on Tuesday. So there will be opportunity, obviously, to you'll get to hear it again, but you will also be able to formulate questions and ask them, or have more time to ask. There were a couple of closing points I wanted to make, if that's possible.
Why don't we hold on just one sec? Elisa or Stephanie, were there any public comments on this item?
This is Elisa, and no public comment received.
Great. Yes, go ahead, Alan.
Sure. So I just wanted, so there's just at a very high level, just where staff is going now, that we've gotten this information and we are working out plans to try to, as we go through the budget process and leading into next year. So I believe you received an email yesterday from the city manager talking about the citywide hiring freeze. So that was an initial thing that we could do to try to generate salary savings from that standpoint. Staff is reviewing carryover appropriations. That's that $39 million number that on one of the slides there that Bob mentioned. And that's something that we routinely do, but we're obviously heavily focused on this now, of looking at what things either are completed and just haven't been returned, or surplus funds haven't been returned to the general fund, or if under the current situation, could we defer or eliminate some projects. I know a few of those right off the top. our hazard mitigation grant program appropriations that we have. So there's a few $1 million of those that are where FEMA has not yet decided that those projects will go forward. We think they will, but there's no sense in tying up those funds as appropriations where we can return them back to the general fund and then reappropriate them when FEMA finally does decide to approve the project. And as I think you've heard before, when we're talking about hazard mitigation grant programs, those projects can sometimes take years before they are approved. So we kind of, when we appropriated all that, we thought that the approval would come pretty quickly. Then we realized that it wasn't. So those are things that right off the top we could kick back to the general fund and start to add a little bit more fund balance that gives us that flexibility.
So Alan, just on that point,
yeah,
Alan, on that point, on slide 33, you talked about the carryover of appropriations. Would you have the ability to give us what that $39 million worth of appropriations are by next Tuesday for the council?
Yeah,
I think it would be helpful.
Yeah, we have a list now. I think like about 17 million of that is FEMA related. So that's your large. But yes, we have a list. We'll be we're reviewing it, and the goal is to have it available to discuss if need be at the study session. So it sounds like we will be discussing that, and we'll have a list for it.
Thank you very much. That'd be very helpful.
Okay, and then then the last thing that we had was we have been in touch with our polling, the company that does polling for us, and we've talked to them about going out and at least getting an opinion survey on making the sales tax measures permanent. We talked to them about what the climate is out there for these types of surveys, and they actually said that it's good. It's not a bad climate to be out doing the surveys. They are currently doing them for 5 cities right now, and the feedback for doing that has been positive. And since everybody's home, the response rates have been really high. So anyway, what I wanted to do was just to make you aware of that and to see if there's any concern or concern from the committee that we move forward with trying to generate questions and getting an opinion survey out on the street.
Okay, thank you for soliciting feedback. Mr. Story, do you have an opinion on that?
Well, sales tax is a challenging conversation with our community, and that was borne out by the last election. But I think they also see, because they are in the throes of this very difficult time, and hopefully understanding the value of said sales taxes, I'd be willing to support a recommendation to moving forward with the poll.
Okay. Vice Mayor Fleming, your thoughts?
I had a child care transition and only was able to catch the last minute of that. I'm asking about a sales tax recommendation. I apologize, but this is the reality of being a parent without school or child care. So can I get the question put to me again?
Yeah, the question was, the city has a relationship with some pollsters, And the question Alan was asking, does the subcommittee want the recommend or endorse the city going out and polling about continuing the sales tax measures?
Yeah, that seems fine to me.
Okay, and yes, Alan, I definitely think we need to, that'd be very helpful information for me to base my decision on to see what the climate is out there now.
All right, very good. We'll get moving on that. And with that, I have nothing else.
Okay, then that's item 4.1. Item 5 was next meeting agenda items. John or Victoria, do either of you have something specific for the agenda, or shall this just evolve as our situation dictates?
I'm okay with evolution.
Yeah, I don't know that we can realistically project what's going to be important at the next meeting because things continue to change so quickly.
Yep, and I'm in complete agreement. Okay, having nothing else on our agenda, we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you all for attending.
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.